The wind carried the scent of dust and sorrow, and somewhere between those miles of silence, two broken souls were about to collide. Love in the wild never arrived dressed in lace. It came with calloused hands and the taste of regret. The sun burned low over the horizon, bleeding gold across the dying plains. Maddox Reeves guided his weary horse along the cracked road that led nowhere and everywhere at once. His boots were coated in red dust, his hat pulled low, shadowing the eyes of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. Every sound in the world seemed to have left this land. Only the creak of the saddle and the whisper of wind through dry grass remained. He wasn't looking for company. Not anymore. Not after the blood he couldn't wash from his hands and the faces that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Maddox had once been a deputy, the kind who believed law could heal the world. Then one night, a gunshot under the moon took a man's life, a good man, his best friend, and his badge felt heavier than any chain. Since then, he'd been a ghost in his own skin. But fate doesn't ask for permission before crossing paths. He saw them first as shapes against the dying light. One small, one still. Near an old wooden fence, half swallowed by dust, a woman lay slumped on a bench. Beside her stood a tiny girl, clutching a threadbare teddy bear and staring at the road as though hope might walk out of the desert. The child's cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears that the dry wind couldn't wipe away. Maddox slowed his horse, his hand hovering near the revolver by instinct, but the sight of the little one made him still. Her lips trembled as she took a hesitant step forward. "Please help us, mister," she whispered, voice cracking in the heat. "Mama won't wake up." The words tore through him like a bullet. He swung down from his horse, dust clouding around his boots. The little girl stood frozen, staring up at him with wide, frightened eyes the color of the sky before a storm. Maddox knelt, trying to make his voice gentle. "Hey there, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Annie," she said softly. Her small fingers clutched the teddy bear tighter. "Mama's sick. She said we were going to find work in town, but then she just fell." Maddox turned to the woman. Her head rested against the wooden rail, strands of blonde hair plastered to her sunburned face. Her dress was torn, her shoes coated in sand. She wasn't breathing evenly. Each breath came like a struggle against the desert itself. He reached out, touched her wrist. Weak pulse, but still there. Relief hit him hard enough to make his throat ache. "We need to get her out of this heat," he said, glancing back at the horizon. No town for miles, only Soyan, fence posts, and the long shadow of his guilt. He looked back at the woman, and that's when he froze. The face beneath the dirt and exhaustion wasn't a stranger's. It was hers, Evelyn Carter. The sister of Samuel Carter, the man who had died in Maddox's arms 6 years ago, the night everything went wrong. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. He could hear nothing but the wind scraping across the earth and the faint rasp of her breathing. The past had found him, right there in the middle of nowhere, in the shape of a dying woman and a child begging for help. Maddox swallowed hard, his hands trembling, despite years of training them not to. He lifted her carefully, her body light, too light, like she'd been running from hunger and grief for far too long. Annie followed close, clutching the hem of his coat. "She's gonna be okay, right?" Annie's voice cracked again. He didn't trust himself to lie, but he nodded anyway. "I'll do everything I can." He laid Evelyn across the back of his horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders to shield her from the setting sun. The girl climbed up beside her, holding her mother's hand, refusing to let go even when the horse started moving. Maddox walked beside them, leading the reins, every step stirring ghosts he thought he'd buried under 100 miles of trail dust. By the time they reached his ranch, a small, lonely place crouched between two canyons. The stars had risen. The old barn stood silent, the windows of the house glowing faintly with lamplight. Maddox pushed open the door and carried Evelyn inside, laying her gently on the bed in the guest room. He fetched a basin, poured water, and wiped her face with slow, steady hands. The touch brought flashes of memory, Evelyn laughing under her brother's arm at the county fair, handing Maddox a slice of pie, teasing him for being too serious. Back then, he'd been a man who believed in second chances. Now he wasn't sure he deserved one. "Mister?" Annie's small voice came from the doorway. She held her bear tight, eyes heavy with sleep, but fixed on him with quiet trust. Your mama's gonna need rest, he said. You can sleep in that chair if you want, or... He hesitated, unsure how to speak to a child after so many years of silence. I can make you a bed by the fire. She shook her head. I want to stay with Mama. Maddox nodded. All right, darling. You stay right there. He stepped out into the porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The desert stretched endless beneath the stars, and somewhere in that vast stillness, he felt something shift inside him. A spark, faint but alive. He sat on the steps, elbows on his knees, staring at the dirt road that had brought them to him. He hadn't believed in fate, or mercy, or love for a long time, but that little girl's voice wouldn't leave his head. Please help us, mister. When the night wind passed through the old fence, it sounded almost like a prayer. Inside, Evelyn stirred in her sleep, whispering a name, her brother's name. Maddox heard it through the half-open door, and the guilt slammed into him again. He clenched his jaw and looked up at the sky. Sam, he murmured under his breath, voice raw. I don't know why she's here, but I swear, I'll make it right this time. The horse in the corral stamped its hooves, restless. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the porch. Maddox stayed there until the stars dimmed and the horizon blushed with dawn. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that he couldn't let those two souls suffer another day. For the first time in years, he had someone to protect again. And somewhere deep down, beneath the scars and silence, he already knew. This wasn't just chance, it was the universe giving him one last chance to be human again. The morning sun crept through the cracks in the shutters, spilling light across the worn floorboards and brushing against Evelyn's pale face. She stirred with a faint groan, her eyelids fluttering as though waking from a long, fevered dream. Her head throbbed, her throat burned, and her body ached from exhaustion. For a moment, she didn't know where she was until she smelled wood smoke and heard the soft clink of metal against a pan. Her eyes opened fully. She found herself lying in a small, tidy room, its walls lined with rough timber and the faint scent of leather and soap. A heavy blanket covered her shoulders. Beside the bed, a small figure sat cross-legged on the floor, humming quietly and brushing her teddy bear's matted fur. Annie, Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking. The little girl's head shot up. Mama! She scrambled to her feet, the bear tumbling to the floor as she threw her tiny arms around her mother. You're awake! The cowboy said you'd be okay. Evelyn frowned faintly. The cowboy? Before Annie could answer, the door creaked open. A tall man stepped inside, carrying a tray. The light caught on his weathered face, his stubble shadowed by years of sun and dust. His eyes, gray, steady, filled with something unspoken, met hers. Morning, he said quietly. You gave us quite a scare. Evelyn froze. She knew that voice. She knew that face. The years hadn't erased it. Her heart stuttered. Maddox Reeves, the man who'd walked away from his brother's grave. The man she had sworn never to forgive. Her breath caught in her throat. You, she said, her voice a whisper, sharp as a blade. It's you. Maddox set the tray down on the bedside table. You shouldn't talk much. You had a fever, probably from dehydration. I boiled some water, and there's soup if you can manage it. Evelyn pushed herself upright, anger rising through the weakness. Why am I here? Because you were half dead by the fence, he replied evenly. Your little girl asked for help. I couldn't right away, you should have. He didn't flinch, but something in his jaw tightened. Maybe, he said, but I didn't. Annie looked between them, confusion softening her features. Mama, he helped you. He gave you his coat. Evelyn glanced down and saw the rough wool blanket tucked around her, the faint scent of tobacco and dust clinging to it. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked away, staring at the wooden wall as if it could hide her trembling hands. Thank you, she muttered, though her tone carried more pride than gratitude. Maddox gave a slight nod and turned to leave, his boots whispering across the floorboards. As the day stretched on, Evelyn tried to rest, but the heat outside pressed against the windows, and her thoughts kept circling back to the man downstairs. The clink of dishes, the creak of floorboards. His presence filled the house. She hated how safe it felt here. By evening, the scent of roasted beans and bread drifted into the room. Annie skipped toward the doorway. "Mama, can I eat with him? Please?" Evelyn hesitated. "Stay where I can see you." Downstairs, Maddox sat by the fire, a simple supper laid out. Bread, beans, and a pot of coffee. Annie climbed onto the chair beside him, her small legs swinging. "Do you have a horse?" she asked eagerly. He smiled faintly. "Sure do. His name's Flint. He's out back. Can I see him tomorrow?" "If your mama says yes." Evelyn listened from the top of the stairs. The sound of Annie's laughter, so light and easy, tore through her like sunlight through fog. She hadn't heard her daughter laugh like that in weeks. Later that night, after Annie had fallen asleep by the hearth, Evelyn came down quietly. She found Maddox still there, staring into the flames, the weight of old memories written in the lines around his eyes. "You think feeding us will erase what you did?" she asked softly. He didn't turn his head. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't think anything can erase it." "Then why help us?" He looked up at her finally, and for a heartbeat the firelight flickered across his face, revealing something fragile beneath the hardened shell. "Because I owe Sam," he said simply. "And maybe because I owe you too." Evelyn's fingers clenched around the fabric of her skirt. "You owe me nothing." "I owe you peace," he said, standing slowly, "and I'll make sure you and your little girl get that before you leave here." She stared at him, torn between anger and something she didn't want to name. Over the next few days, the house began to change. Maddox fixed the roof of the barn, tended to his cattle, and came home each evening with dust on his boots and a quiet word for Annie, who followed him everywhere like a shadow. Evelyn tried to keep her distance, sewing by the window or washing clothes by the well. But every time she looked up, she found Maddox watching her from afar, not with guilt anymore, but with quiet reverence, like a man seeing sunrise after years of darkness. One afternoon, clouds rolled in heavy and dark, and the wind howled through the canyons. A storm was brewing fast. Evelyn rushed outside to pull the sheets off the line when the first drops began to fall. Maddox came running from the barn, shouting over the rising wind, "Get inside!" She tried to grab the last blanket, but a sudden gust knocked her backward, and before she could fall, his arms were around her. For a moment, the world stilled, the thunder distant, the rain suspended in the air. She looked up, startled, finding herself pressed against his chest, his heart hammering beneath the soaked fabric of his shirt. Their eyes met. For the first time, she didn't see the man who'd destroyed her family. She saw a man drowning in his own ghosts, just as lost as she was. He let go quickly, stepping back as if burned. "Sorry," he muttered, running a hand through his wet hair. "It's fine," she said quietly, though her pulse betrayed her. That night, as the storm raged outside, Evelyn sat near the fire, drying Annie's clothes. Maddox entered silently, his hair still damp, holding a folded blanket. "For the little one," he said. "Thank you," she replied, her tone softer this time. He nodded and turned to leave. But as lightning flashed, she spoke again. "Sam, my brother, what really happened in that night?" He stopped. The air between them grew heavy. "He was caught in a crossfire," Maddox said, voice low. "We were ambushed by rustlers near the canyon. He pushed me out of the way, took the bullet meant for me. I tried to save him, Evelyn. I swear I did." Her throat tightened, tears burning at the edges of her vision. "All these years, I thought you pulled that trigger." "I'd rather have taken the bullet than live with that thought," he said. "But I didn't have the courage to tell you then. You wouldn't have believed me." She stared at him, the weight of truth and loss pressing against her ribs. The rain beat harder against the windows, like the world itself was mourning what had been lost between them. Finally, she whispered, "I believe you now." Maddox's eyes lifted to hers, uncertain, searching. For the first time, neither of them spoke in anger. Only silence stretched between them, and in that silence, something fragile began to grow, a truce, a warmth, the faint beginning of forgiveness. Annie stirred in her sleep beside the fire, mumbling softly. Evelyn tucked the blanket around her daughter and looked back at the cowboy standing in the doorway. He gave a small nod, tipping his hat before disappearing into the storm. That night, Evelyn sat awake long after the thunder faded, staring at the empty chair across from her. For years, she had carried nothing but bitterness and fear. But now, for the first time since Sam's death, she felt something else, something dangerous, something alive. Hope. The dawn came quiet after the storm, the earth still damp and breathing from the rain. The ranch smelled of wet dust and new beginnings. Evelyn stood by the porch, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching as thin ribbons of light stretched across the plains. She had spent half the night thinking about Maddox Reeves, the man she had once sworn to hate, and the man who now haunted her thoughts for reasons she didn't understand. Somewhere between the silence and the thunder, something had changed between them. Inside, Annie was drawing with a bit of charcoal she'd found near the fireplace. On the worn page of an old ledger, she had drawn 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, and one small, standing under a bright, uneven sun. She held it up proudly when her mother turned. "That's you, me, and Mr. Reeves," she said. "I think he's lonely, Mama." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Maybe he is, sweetheart." Out by the corral, Maddox was mending a broken fence post, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the early light catching on the faint scars that mapped his arms. When Evelyn approached, he looked up, his eyes soft but guarded. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She hesitated. "I wanted to thank you. For everything, for helping us, and for telling me the truth." He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, avoiding her gaze. "You don't owe me thanks. I owed you honesty. But honesty's rare out here," she said quietly. "So I think it counts." For a long moment, the only sound between them was the groan of the windmill, turning slow and steady above the well. Maddox finally met her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't look like a ghost. He looked alive, uncertain, and almost hopeful. The peace of that morning didn't last long. Before noon, the sound of hooves shattered the calm. Hard, fast, urgent. Maddox's instincts kicked in. He dropped the hammer and reached for his rifle. A group of riders appeared on the ridge, dust rising behind them like a storm cloud. He counted 4 men, bounty hunters by the look of their coats and the iron at their belts. Evelyn froze at the door, clutching Annie to her chest. "Who are they?" "They're here for me, but they'll," Maddox said grimly. "Old debts die slow in this land." The riders came closer, the leader's voice carrying across the wind. "Maddox Reeves, you're wanted for the Caldwell Ridge shootout. They say you killed a deputy and fled with stolen gold." Maddox's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "I don't care what it is," the man sneered. "There's a bounty on your head, and we aim to collect." Before Evelyn could speak, Maddox handed her his rifle. "Take Annie inside." "Stay down. I'm not leaving you out here alone," she said. "Evelyn, please." His tone was firm but soft, almost breaking. "If anything happens, you take her and ride. Promise me." She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "I can't." But the sound of gunfire cut her off. Bullets split the air, hitting the fence and shattering the dry trough. Maddox returned fire, moving with the calm precision of a man who'd lived too long in danger. The horse whinnied, the air filled with dust and echoes of death. Evelyn grabbed Annie and ran inside, hard hammering. Minutes passed like lifetimes. When she peeked through the window, she saw Maddox crouched behind the well, his hat blown off, blood staining the sleeve of his shirt. The bounty hunters had spread out, trying to flank him. Her breath caught. He was outnumbered. Without thinking, she grabbed the shotgun that hung above the hearth. Annie tugged at her skirt, eyes wide. "Mama, don't go!" Evelyn bent down, cupping her daughter's face. "You stay right here, Angel. Close your eyes and pray." Before the child could protest, Evelyn ran out into the sunlight. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder. She saw one of the hunters circling behind the barn, rifle raised toward Maddox. She didn't think, she just aimed and fired. The man dropped where he stood. The recoil nearly knocked her backward, but she didn't stop. Maddox turned in shock, eyes locking on her. "Evelyn! Keep fighting," she shouted. Together they held the line until the last echo of gunfire faded into silence. When the dust settled, 2 men lay dead, the others retreating into the distance. Maddox staggered, clutching his bleeding arm. Evelyn ran to him, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth against the wound. "You're hit," she whispered. "I've had worse," he said, trying to smile. "But you, what were you thinking?" She looked at him through tears. "I was thinking I wasn't about to lose another good man to this cursed land." He stared at her for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them, something stronger than gratitude, heavier than fear. Later, when the sheriff finally arrived, summoned by the sound of gunfire, he looked at the scene, then at Maddox. Heard there were men after you again, the sheriff just said. Turns out the records are wrong. You were cleared 2 months ago. The witnesses finally came forward. Maddox blinked, stunned. Cleared? The sheriff nodded. You're a free man now, Reeves. Guess the desert finally decided to give you a break. When the sheriff rode off, Maddox turned to Evelyn. She stood with her arm around Annie, the wind tugging at her hair. For the first time, there was no anger in her eyes. Only peace. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the red hills, Maddox sat on the porch steps, his arm bandaged, his heart strangely light. Annie ran up to him, her small hand clutching her old teddy bear. She climbed onto his knee and looked up at him with that same innocent sincerity that had stopped him days ago. Please help us, mister, she said with a giggle, repeating her first words to him. Then she added softly, but this time, don't go away. Maddox felt his throat tighten. He lifted her gently into his arms. I'm not going anywhere, little one. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, her eyes catching the last light of sunset. She wore a clean dress now, her hair loose, her face no longer drawn by fear. For a moment, she just stood there, watching the man who had once been her enemy, now cradling her child like his own. Maddox rose slowly, setting Annie down. He took a hesitant step toward Evelyn, removing his hat. I never thought I'd find peace again, he said quietly. Not after Sam. Not after everything. She met his gaze, her voice barely a whisper. You didn't just find peace, Maddox. You gave it to us, too. He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing against hers. The touch was light, trembling, yet full of everything they hadn't said. The air between them shimmered with the golden light of the dying sun. Annie's laughter echoed as she twirled in the yard, the teddy bear dangling from her arm. Evelyn and Maddox watched her, their hands still entwined. As twilight settled over the ranch, Maddox looked at Evelyn and smiled. A real smile, one that came from the part of his soul he'd thought was long dead. You and that little girl, he murmured. You saved me. Evelyn's eyes glistened, her voice barely audible over the evening wind. Maybe we all saved each other. He pulled her gently closer. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with fire and gold, and for the first time in years, the desert didn't feel empty anymore. Behind them, Annie's small voice carried through the fading light. Mama, can we stay here forever? Evelyn smiled up at Maddox. Yes, baby, she said softly. I think we finally found home. And as the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon, the cowboy who had once wandered the wastelands stood in the doorway of his own redemption, with the woman who forgave him and the child who taught him how to love again.